Good morning, everyone. Please take your seats. We're going to get started. Okay, we'll just give it a few more seconds. All right, good morning and welcome to day 3 of Media Freedom Festival. We've had an absolutely fantastic time over the last 2 days. And today we are covering some really difficult but interesting and dynamic issues. This morning we are starting off the program with a practical session on hate speech. We're going to be covering what hate speech is, how we grapple with it, what it means for local context. And we're going to go into depth around what Media Monitoring Africa is doing to try and help combat issues around hate speech. We are really excited to be launching our Hate Speech Spotters program. My colleagues will be taking you through just a very sort of broad overview of what the program entails, and providing you with some really nice practical ways of countering hate speech. That will set the scene for our next session, which will be starting at 11, which is going to be a really fun, interactive Rate the Hate game. And here you'll see participants judging whether various scenarios actually constitute hate speech or not. So please stay with us to join us for that session as well. I'm Tandy Smith, by the way. I'm head of programs at Media Monitoring Africa. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. And I'll be helping facilitate the sessions this morning. So please feel free to interact, ask questions, challenge, and debate some of these issues. It should be a really interesting session. So really excited to kick us off, and I will start by introducing Azola Daile, who's our program manager for advocacy, lobbying and litigation, who will kick us off with the workshop. Thanks, Azola.
Morning, colleagues, comrades, friends, family. As Tandy said, my name is Azola Daile, program manager for advocacy, lobbying and litigation at Media Monitoring Africa. I'll briefly take you through some regulatory frameworks of hate speech and some definitions as well. Thank you. So under international law, currently, there is no one single definition, but it is recognized globally that by different stakeholders that hate speech has a devastating impact on both individuals and communities at large. So the different stakeholders obviously includes internet users, us as activists, it includes policymakers, it includes government, it includes the tech platforms themselves. So there's consensus between these stakeholder groups that indeed hate speech has adverse effects. It is further acknowledged that it is the responsibility, the collective responsibility of all these stakeholders to then take measures towards combating hate speech. I have this urge of wanting to say disinformation because I'm used to speaking about disinformation as well. So though there may not be a singular definition under international law, here in South Africa domestically, we actually do have a definition of late, and this comes after the Constitutional Court amendment of PEPUDA, after the John Xolani versus the Human Rights Commission and others case that was heard in the Constitutional Court. So this case comes after Mr. John Xolani the late, who is a veteran journalist and a former diplomat, penned an article on the Sunday Sun, if I'm not mistaken, titled "Call Me Names, but Gay is Not Okay." So basically the article was against the LGBTQI plus community and propagating what was said to be a hate speech. So in that particular case, the court ruled that the old definition in PEPUDA, Section 10 of PEPUDA, which is the Equality Act, was vague and ambiguous on some sections, particularly on whether the sections should be read collectively or individually. And therefore it was found that in that current form, it does encroach on freedom of expression. As I've mentioned before, it was then amended by the Constitutional Court, and this was the new definition that was given. So this is the definition that we have and we use currently here in South Africa. It is as follows: hate speech is the advocacy of hatred that is based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or any other ground, and that constitute incitement to cause harm. I think in the previous definition of hate speech, they did not have the caveat of any other ground, particularly that of sexual orientation, which was the base of the article and the case at the Court. So the court also held that hate speech should be and must be assessed objectively, factually, and in the context of which it came. And it must show that it has real and immediate danger of inciting harm. As I've mentioned, it is broader than the previous definition under PEPUDA, as it includes advocacy of hatred based on any grounds and not just the grounds that are listed on the Act. Also requires a real and immediate danger of inciting harm. So this particular definition has not yet been incorporated into legislation, but it's a working definition. We also use it for our Rule 411 platform, but you'll hear more about that later on. But of course, it is likely to be the basis of any new hate speech law that is enacted in the country. So under this new definition, hate speech, for speech to be considered as hate speech, it has to have 3 elements. So these 3 elements are as follows. It has to be based on one or more of the prohibited grounds. There are examples of prohibited grounds. I won't go through them now, but I'm sure you have an idea of some of them. It must pose real and immediate danger of inciting harm. It must promote or propagate hatred. Speech must encourage or support negative attitudes or feelings towards individuals or particular groups of people. So it applies to whether myself as Azola or myself as Azola, who is part of, a group of people, whether I am an asylum seeker, whether I'm part of the LGBTI community, or I'm part of, some Christian or otherwise community. So moving on to some of the available regulatory instruments that speak to hate speech. So of course, this is just an overview. The list is not exhaustive, so you might find that some instruments do not appear here, but I think, and I can assure you that they do appear in the final document, of which you guys, if you're interested, will get next week. It's in the final stages of design. So the sources of hate speech regulatory instruments in South Africa are found in 4 different instruments, and these are, of course, our celebrated Constitution, in PEPUDA, which is the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, otherwise known as the Equality Act, in the Prevention and Combating of Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Bill. I think this bill is currently sitting with the National Council of Provinces, where they will then, after deliberation, send it to the president for assent, and then it will become an act. So currently it's still very much a bill. And then there's also the Film and Publications Act. So obviously, freedom of expression is guaranteed in the Constitution, but of course has some limitations. In Section 16.2 of the Constitution, there are limitations that speak to hate speech. So speech may be limited if the law of limitation is reasonable and justifiable in an open and democratic society based on human dignity, equality, and freedom. Under this particular instrument, hate speech is not protected speech, as it's said there. And then moving on to the second one, PEPUDA. PEPUDA also prohibits hate speech, and it defines it there as, defined as persons on the basis, discriminating on persons on the basis of race, gender, sex, pregnancy, and whatnot. Speech that is likely to incite harm and also promote hatred. So if you can follow, you see here also that it does have those 3 elements. It has to promote hatred, it has to be on the prohibited grounds, and it has to also incite harm. Section 10 of PEPUDA, which was recently amended following the Kolane case, places a civil prohibition rather than criminal. So rather than sending people to jail, people are usually fined and said to do other things. But of course, the courts can also send to the National Director of Public Prosecutions to institute criminal proceedings if there should be a need. So it provides for several remedies to be granted by special equality courts. And as I've said, the court may refer a case to the Director of Public Prosecutions for the institution of criminal proceedings in terms of relevant legislation. And then the other instrument that we have is the hate crime and the hate speech and hate crimes bill. I've mentioned that the bill is currently sitting with the NCOP. It also defines hate speech as intended speech to incite harm against any person or group on one or more of the prohibited grounds, similar to the Constitution and the PEPUDA. So the person has to intentionally publish, propagate, or advocate with a clear intention to be harmful or to incite harm, to promote or to propagate hate based on the prohibited grounds, which include a host of categories. There they are. I won't go through them now. So the bill makes it an offense to display or make available any material that constitute hate speech or direct hate speech at a specific person or intended group. However, the bill does not criminalize all forms of offensive or hurtful speech, only speech that is intended to incite hatred or that is harmful is considered as hate speech. So not all speech may be hate speech. Even if it's hurtful, it has to have that element of being harmful and inciting harm. So we can't just run to the equality course when a friend of ours teases us. And then lastly, there's the Film and Publications Act. It prohibits any distributions of films, publication, or games that promote hate against any person or group based on the prohibited grounds. Section 24 of this particular instrument puts an emphasis that, with our own emphasis rather, that any person who knowingly, so again, knowingly or intentionally distributes in any medium, including social media, so not just on films and publications and whatnot. So the FPB now says that including any medium, as I said here, including internet and social media, and which amounts to propaganda for war, incitement of violence, or advocates hate speech, shall be guilty of an offense. But obviously we speak to hate speech, and that will be an offense if you distribute that on any medium. They will be liable upon conviction to a fine not exceeding 150,000 rands or imprisonment for a period not exceeding 2 years or both. So that is what is found under the FPB Act. And then there are some international instruments as well. I won't go deep into this. We also have time limitations, but I'll just read them out to you. So there is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I think it's one of the most popular of our international instruments. There is also the International Covenant on the Elimination of All Forms of Discriminations. And there is a regional instrument, our very own African Charter on Human and People's Rights. So these instruments are also important, even though they are not domestic, because they are legally binding on states that have ratified them. And I am sure that South Africa has, in the past years, ratified all three of these international instruments that also speak on hate speech. Let me pass these ones. So it's still the very same instruments, but I won't go into them now, unfortunately. As I mentioned before, the extensive document with all of these will be made available to you guys. Yes, so these instruments, basically, all of them including the international ones, are designed to protect the rights of all South Africans and those living within our borders, and to promote a society that is free of discrimination and hatred. We should remember that these instruments, as I've said in the previous slide, are legally binding through ratification, and we have done so as South Africa to address our problems of racism and hate speech and all the other ills that exist in our society. So this means that our government is actually obliged to comply with these provisions of these treaties, and if not, there are legal recourses for accountability, particularly by the international community. So hate speech in our country. Between 2014 and 2019, the South African Human Rights Commission says that it has received more than 3,000 complaints of hate speech. But unfortunately, the number of people actually charged or convicted of hate speech is much lower. If you remember from the definitions I gave, I had said that hurtful speech does not amount to harmful speech or hate speech. It has to have those three caveats of advocacy for hatred, it has to have incitement of violence, and it has to be against the prohibited grounds of either race, gender, sex, marriage status, and whatnot. So of these complaints, only 12 people were convicted of hate speech in South Africa between the years 2016 and 2019. So as I've said, most likely in many of these cases, while the speech may have been offensive or even horrible, on its own, it may have not met the threshold which needs those three elements of what constitutes hate speech. So some examples now of hate speech in South Africa. I'm sure all of you are familiar with these. The Penny Sparrow saga in 2016, where she went on a racist rant on Facebook and compared, unfortunately, Black people to monkeys. She was unfortunately, or fortunately rather, convicted for hate speech and fined 150,000 rands. There was also Vicky Momberg in the same year, was caught on video using a racial slur, which I will not say here, 48 times. I don't know the significance of saying it repeatedly, but yeah, she was also convicted of hate speech and sentenced to 3 years in prison, 2 of which were suspended. I think she did spend the 1 year. I don't
was passing through the mic. It's important that you clean up your digital footprint, or you know what your footprint is. If in the past you have posted content that might be hate speech, it's always important to go back and delete it. If you've even liked, wowed or ha-had content, that is hate speech, just go and unlike and follow, and just make sure you protect yourself so that nobody comes and say, oh, you're here now talking about how we should not be hate speakers, and yet you had, such content in 2016 or 2015. So just always make sure your footprint is good, it's clean, and also you have not shared any of such content in the past. Very important also to make sure that you remove all personal information, your email addresses, your home numbers. I know it might be surprising, but there are people actually who do share their home address online, and that is not safe. So remove all personal information from your online spaces so that you do not become a victim of doxing, so that you're not harmed. If you do not know what doxing is, it's fine. You can just come to me when we're having coffee and I can nicely explain to you, or when we're having wine in the evening, and you're all invited. Okay, so please, Facebook does have that, I don't know what they call it, but the feature where they give you every day your memories. And for those people who are on Facebook, I know there are fewer people, there could be fewer people in this room because who uses Facebook anymore anyway. But if you do have Facebook, there's a memory feature there, just use it, go clean up. If you saw that you posted something, just use it every day to clean up your footprint. Not just because, you are a hate speech spotter, but also it's always just good to make sure that your digital footprint is good. Okay, I don't know what okay, there you go. I don't know why I'm seeing myself on the screen and not the content that I'm sharing. Or did I stop sharing? Sorry, please forgive me. Tech people, please help me. Thank you. How many know what their footprint is? No. I still need you.
Okay. You can just go to.
So the other thing I forgot to mention is when you're cleaning up when you're trying to protect yourself online before you become a spotter, the other thing I forgot to mention is that, I did mention that it becomes too much, the content might become too much. But there are various organizations that offer support, in case you need it, in case the content becomes too much for you. Just get in touch with us and we will connect you to such organizations. Or you can find a strategy. Other people find that, well, I'm not going to recommend certain strategies, but there are a lot of ways that you can decompress and just make sure that your mental health is protected from all the hate speech content that you are seeing. Perfect. Okay, so strategies. The first one of the strategies that have been employed or are being employed around the world, even in South Africa, even including by us as MMA, is a strategy that has to do with responding directly to hateful tweets or messages online. So under this, we have a few tactics. The first one is, of course, the obvious reporting the hate speech content as you find it online. Thankfully, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, these Instagram, these platforms, they do have provisions for you to report hate speech on their platform. So please make use of them. But before you decide to click that report button, it's always important that you capture the evidence, you collect the evidence, and you can do this through, screen shooting, taking a screenshot or saving web page links. This is because people often realize that, sometimes they realize that this content might be hateful, let me delete it. And then they come and repost it again. We want you to, we encourage you to collect the evidence. Just make sure you have the evidence before you click the report button on Facebook or Twitter. But before you even report to Facebook or Twitter or TikTok, we always encourage that you report it to Real 411. And like I said, my colleague will come later on to talk to you about how you can go about it. But report it to Real 411, and then you can go back to the platform and report such content. So important that you gather the evidence before you can go on to a report. The second tactic under direct response to hateful tweets and messages is counter speaking, so counter speech. And this is basically where you are responding directly to the hateful content or the hate speech content that you are coming across online. And people have found that censoring a hate speech is ineffective, so sometimes ineffective, and often seen as a discourse, of persecution to the people who are spreading the content. So for those reasons, or for that reason, it's been found to be not as effective, and instead what is encouraged in place of censoring such content is counter speaking or counter speech as a method. So this is where you are refuting the discriminatory ideas by providing facts, by being logical, by supporting the victims, and just spreading neutral messages. So that's just what is involved in counter speech as a tactic. There are quite a number of types of counter speech, but I can only, I'll introduce you to two. And the first one is organized counter messaging campaigns. The second one is non-organized. So in the first one, organized counter messaging campaigns. So this is where, for instance, you as a supporter, or you as a woke member of the public who's been through this training, you find such content, you gather the evidence, obviously, and then you go to your fellow supporters. Remember, it's a network. You take that content to your fellow supporters, and together, of course, with the backing of MMA, you go and flood in the comment section on that post, or the original post, you go and flood it with alternative speak, with counter speech. Remember, it has to be logical, it has to be factual, just so that you're refuting whatever the original speaker or the hate speaker posted. And then the opposite of that is the spontaneous organic responses, where you just come across the content and you decide to counter speak whatever content is there. This might seem like a very a good tactic to employ when you're, a good strategy to employ, but it's always important to remember that there are a few things that you should do, that you shouldn't do before, or as you counter speaking. And it's always just important that when you are engaging with such a person, you stay calm. Remember, many of these people who are hate speakers are very angry, or they just want to spread anger or fear or hatred. And you need to stay calm, you need to ask questions, you need to refer to potential outcomes. For instance, what is a potential outcome for whatever the person is spreading? If they're saying, let's go out there and kill gay people because gay people should not be existing, that is very dangerous speech. And that is a speech that can result in offline violence against that group of people. So you need to talk about potential outcomes as you are counter speaking. You also need to label the comment and not the person. So do not call anyone stupid. Do not call anyone racist. Do not call anyone anyone who's hate speaker. Do not call them these ways. Just label whatever they're talking about, not them as a person. And do show empathy with and connection with the targets. And then importantly, the don'ts. Like I said, don't label people. Don't be hostile. Don't talk down to the person you're trying to engage, and also don't silence them with threats. You will see what will happen to you if you continue doing this and that. You will see. That's also not it's not encouraged, and it doesn't yield any positive results. Okay, so the third tactic is amplifying positive voices. Media Monitoring Africa and a few other organizations, or a number of other organizations, are working very hard to combat hate speech online. And so it's always important that for you as a supporter, or you as a person who's interested in combating hate speech online, to amplify the work of such organizations, or even, it doesn't have to be organizations, even just somebody. There's always that person that is always you know, promoting positive messages, is working to combat hate speech online. Just share the work online, share the website, share the blogs, share the content. Just we need more voices that are in this space, positive voices amplified, just to tone down the voice of the hate speakers, which is very loud. Even just one hate speaker is very loud. Okay. The other one, the other strategy is employing dialogue and other engagements. So the first one tactic here is in-person or digital dialogues. So this is an example of this is where you've identified that Lista Namumba is a hate speaker. Oh my God, she's so crazy on Twitter, talking about, you know, this and that, promoting hate speech. And then maybe you as Spotters or Media Monitoring Africa or whichever, you know, organization, you engage Lista to say what you're doing is wrong and these are the possible outcomes. You engage them, you educate them. That way, sometimes it's not guaranteed, but sometimes, you know, you might convert Lista to actually stop spreading hate, or you might not, but it's just also one of the options out there. So in-person or digital dialogues. And also just digital responses at scale. So one of the tactics under this, and I'm sure you've come across this, is the hashtag takeovers. I'm sure you've seen this. You might not have seen it in the space of hate speech, but I'm sure you've seen on Twitter those, are they called, what is the person who tweets called? Is it a tweet, a Twitter? The person who, an Xer. So you might have seen the Xers. They use they post something, maybe promoting their scone business, and they use all the hashtags that are trending. Have you seen that? So that's just an example at a low level of hashtag taking over. But they're also user-generated hashtag takeovers that work, especially in this case of hate speech. So you can also use that as a tactic to spread your positive messages or to counter-speak, you know, to share your counter-speech narrative. So that's also an effective tool that you can use. Unfortunately, hashtag takeovers are not effective in the long run, but they will achieve their purpose in the short term. So again, another example. This one, I'm sure everybody knows, the naming and shaming. I remember once, I think a couple of years back on social media, there was, I've forgotten the hashtag, but there were people who were coming forth saying, so and so raped me, or so me too, or the South African, yes, say my next, South African, yes. So they were naming and shaming people who allegedly had sexually violated them. And I remember a few days after that seeing were reading in the newspaper that somebody had taken one of the people who had named and shamed them to court. And so before you employ this tactic, just remember that it's not really effective and you could be opening yourself to more harm if you want to name and shame. But it's also one of the tactics that are being used to highlight human rights abuses, or also just to highlight hate speakers. Again, even with this one, there's an ongoing debate whether it's effective, but it's being done, and in some instances it works, in other instances it doesn't. Okay, my favorite strategy: building response mechanisms to prevent or mitigate offline violence. So this is basically under this strategy, or the whole essence of this strategy is to mitigate offline violence. So while other tactics or other strategies are about combating online violence or online hate, this one focuses more effort on preventing offline violence. You can all agree with me that oftentimes actually hate speech that starts online often culminates in offline violence. Every time, or almost every time, there's violence against, for instance, migrants, it will start somewhere. It will start somewhere online. Every time there's violence, or almost every time there's violence against another group, it will often, it's most likely to have started online. So under this strategy, this is where now a lot of focus is taken to prevent offline violence, especially during heightened periods. And in South Africa and in many other parts, it's usually during election time where we see that there's a flare or the more incidences of hate speech online and also offline violence. So this strategy includes the first thing, it includes setting up an early warning, early response mechanism. And then the second one is setting up a network or programs, long-term programs that combat offline violence. And these are this is building a response mechanism strategy. It's different, like I said, from other strategies because it involves it's focused on preventing offline violence, but what's also makes it different from the others is that it also involves actively monitoring hate speech online, analyzing, collecting information, analyzing it, whether and what is being analyzed in this content is whether such content, one, is harmful, and also whether such content has the potential for escalation into offline violence. And then there are two response mechanisms that are employed here. The first is that of trained first responders, where you as hate speech would feature under. You are there monitoring the content online, you're collecting the evidence, you're analyzing it, and then you're sharing it with decision makers who in this case might be organizations that are working to prevent or in peace building strategies, or also organizations or law enforcement agencies even. It's like I said, it's my favorite because it's a whole coordinated effort of addressing hate speech. The second mechanism employed is the creation of a network of organizations or a network of individuals. After the first responders collect the evidence, they relate to law enforcement agencies or to organizations working in the space. But also there's an additional tactic or an additional provision where there's actual support for victims of hate speech, and this can be psychological support offered to the victims. Okay, so just important to mention, MMA is working to establish an early warning response mechanism. We're already, like I said, employing some of the tactics under this strategy, the building response mechanisms strategy. And some of these, you will see it through our work, Rule 411. Okay, I'm almost there. But the other strategy to mention is that of nonviolent action. We've all heard of boycotts. Boycotting a platform, boycotting a product, boycotting this and that in an effort to get the attention of either maybe the platform. And a good example of this is in 2020, where an organization called Stop Hate for Profit, gathered the masses and they did a boycott of Facebook in order to get Mark Zuckerberg's attention, because a lot of reported content on hate speech content on his platform was going unaddressed and was not being handled. So they wanted to get his response. So they boycotted that, and it was very effective in that, how they boycotted, it wasn't just you and me staying away from Facebook, because again, that won't really do much damage to him, but they were targeting advertisers. So advertisers, and Mark makes, these people make much of the money from the advertisers. Targeted the advertisers, they advertised together with the organization and their supporters. They boycotted Facebook, and Mark felt it and was forced to engage with the organization and their supporters. So that's an example of nonviolent action. You don't have to, there's nothing involved except you just boycotting, for instance, or protesting, like what happened in Tokyo at the Twitter offices. A lot of protesters gathered there with the actual messages or placards carrying the messages, the hateful content that they had reported that was still appearing on Twitter despite vigorous reporting. So they showed up at the Twitter offices in Tokyo and didn't leave, and demanded that such content be taken down from Twitter, and it worked. So just an example. Another strategy is that of media campaigns, public awareness raising strategies. So this is where now we engage the media, and this can be the traditional media or the new media, to promote or circulate content or campaigns at at hate speech or addressing hate speech or looking at addressing hate speech. And these campaigns don't have to be only targeted at the hate speakers, but they can also be targeted at the policy, policymakers. They can also be targeted at platforms themselves. It might be difficult, and it has been seen to be difficult to promote or such campaigns, for instance, on social media or Twitter, on the very platform where hate speech is, rampant, but it does work. So that's what that campaign involves. And it's also important to mention that the campaigns created under the strategies, just to emphasize, can be campaigns on raising awareness to the problem of hate speech and how it impacts victims. That's a good strategy, but can also be about legal ethical frameworks around hate speech, the ones that Azola mentioned in his presentation, and just talking about how offenders can get punished. Sometimes people are, even if you tell people that you're going to go to jail for 2 years or you're going to be fined $150,000, it will deter some people from spreading such content. Others, they won't care. And so in such an instance, that's where you need to employ the other strategies. So as I go back to my seat, I would like to know, you don't have to respond now, you can engage me later, but I would like to know from your perspective, which strategy or a combination of strategies would work best in addressing hate speech in South Africa? One, and then two, okay, no, let me just leave you with that question. You don't have to answer now, and there's no prize for that, but just a couple of tools if you are interested to make your work easier, because you don't have to go, and it will be cumbersome for you to go to each and every content on TikTok and seeing whether this is hate speech. But what you can do is use a few tools or a couple of tools that are available for you to collect a lot of data. You just put in your keywords, if it's hate speech, whatever is trending that time, if it's xenophobia, if it's elections, if it's whatever is trending and whatever content you're trying to pull out. So just use some of these tools. There's one, Trends Map, which I personally like. I find it to be very effective. There's also another one called CrowdTangle, and then there's TweetBeaver as well, and a few other. So just familiarize yourselves with these. Are available online. Some of them are free, others you need to pay a little bit of something, but you're always welcome to use a free one. You can even use Excel, and under this program, we can easily teach you how to use advanced Excel as a collecting tool. So you use these tools, collect the content, and then you report to Real 411, which my colleague is going to come and talk to you about later. I'm open to questions now or when we're having tea. When we're having tea. Thank you for listening. I'm going to go upon Nomshado to just talk to you about the intersectionality of hate speech and mis and disinformation. Round of applause, round of applause.
Morning, everyone. As Lester mentioned, I'll be doing a very quick, and I'm hopefully I can literally do it in less than 10 minutes. But what I'm meant to do today is to help the audience, and particularly you, to understand when we are saying that disinformation is an intersectional threat, particularly how it interwebs with hate speech. How does that look like? And why is that important for us to understand? But first, I believe my colleague did go through the different definitions, and I think it's important for us to understand what do we mean when we say disinformation. Now I'm joining Azola saying hate speech. But what do we mean when we say disinformation? What is the definition and what is the difference? I'll be also going through the intersecting strategies, exploring how disinformation intersects with other online harms, particularly hate speech in this regard, and the consequences of this intersection. So mis and disinformation. A lot of times we use these definitions interchangeably without really actually understanding what we mean. So we hear misinformation, we hear disinformation, and in other terms, we also hear individuals use fake news, which is a term myself that I do not like using because I believe that it's used by those in power trying to dodge accountability and being held to account. So disinformation is deliberate content that is created to cause harm. The end agenda for disinformation is to cause harm in different forms. Misinformation is the sharing of false narratives without the intent, without being deliberate. So the difference there is I'm not the creator. I might be sharing with good intentions, meaning I want to warn you, right, of a certain narrative that is going on, but I'm not sure and I do not know the origination of this content. And that's where the difference is. Where disinformation thrives is through misinformation, because it requires engagement, it requires sharing, it requires you to be the one to share it within your network and within your echo chambers. I like to focus on malinformation, which I think ties quite strongly with hate speech. And I think it's one of the definitions that we don't really highlight or put a spotlight on. And this is the use of personal information that is used to target certain individuals or institutions. And this can come in different forms. And this is where we see in most times harassment come to life online, right? It's me, and I think we've seen this, particularly even leaders in power using personal information of journalists themselves and putting it on their, for example, Twitter, now X, platforms with their numerous amounts of followers and saying, go and attack this individual. Now imagine that individual themselves are put in a vulnerable position because now not only is their personal information put on a very public platform, but at the same time, different forms of hate speech and harassment comes to life. And I want to paint that scene when I'm now going to be talking about the intersection itself. The intersection of myths and disinformation, when we're talking about hate speech, I think creates a very complex web of challenges. The demand, for example, when we're talking about the comprehensive, and I think my colleagues touched on this a bit, the multi-dimensional approaches that we need to start looking at, because not only are we dealing with hate speech, but we're also dealing with elements of disinformation at the same time. And how does this web look like? And I might actually want to highlight complex web look like. So we've got the intersecting strategies, right? This is how hate speech often draws on stereotypes, right? It looks at race, ethnicity, gender, or other attributes of identity. The perpetrators themselves, when it comes to exploiting these stereotypes, most often they craft narratives that are based and have a foundation on disinformation, meaning the end agenda here is for me to create harm. Already that on its own has a magnifying amplification because already the narrative and the message is embedded within hate speech. The amplifying impact of this is what is happening now is that because these two are crossing with one another, the threats that each all come together are magnified, meaning the impact of this, not only are we seeing it online, but we're also seeing it translate to offline. So online hate speech actually thrives even more offline because what happens is, I used an example earlier on somebody's personal details being uploaded. It started off with a cell phone number. It ended up with somebody's children's schools being exposed, somebody's house address being exposed, what time they knock off, what time they get to work, when do they go to the gym. Such information all inspired and all started by one narrative with an agenda to cause harm. Then the other web, we're looking at how this links to online harassment and the interchanging elements that we are seeing in terms of these harms. How, and oftentimes when we're talking incitement, right, when we're talking about the harms of intensifying these inflicted harms on an individual, and how this damage ends up being like a wheel when we're talking about disinformation. Now we've got bots and botnets amplifying the same narrative that was started on hate speech. Now, particularly when it's done in a vulnerable environment, meaning perhaps it's a time of conflict or a time of unrest within a certain country. And this narrative of disinformation, which is obviously amplified through hate speech, is seen online by an individual, 15, 20 accounts saying the same thing. And now it's embedded within somebody's mindset, right? That this is how I should identify this individual, or this is the speech that I should attach to this individual. So not only does this actually explain how complex it is, but it also speaks to, when we're talking about approaches and when we're talking about solutions, it really needs to come from a multidimensional perspective, and particularly looking at how vast our digital realm is. And this, I just wanted to shine a spotlight on it, because I think amplification more than anything is key when it comes to getting the agenda achieved of harm. And what we've always been talking about, particularly when we're saying dissemination, aside from technology, we hardly ever shine a light on offline networks, right? How I think Lester mentioned how these strategies can actually also be used to counter hate speech, but it ends up being even magnified more because the content we're seeing offline now becomes online, and it's a whole boycott, it's a whole protest, it's a whole narrative that, for example, these particular individuals or set of races are doing 1, 2, 3. We need to come together, right? It might not look much. That picture might be just one picture of maybe 20 individuals, but how it's amplified online and given status and given importance, it actually, reads differently for various amounts of users on different platforms. And the one key element that really drives the intersectionality of hate speech and disinformation is the role of the emotional appeal that happens at the back end. And by this, I'm talking about 3 in particular. 1, fear. Fear is a very powerful motivator. And I think we've seen this in numerous cases. And how mis and disinformation can easily exploit that emotion by exaggerating threats and mix that with hate speech. You've got a very deadly combination, right? Second to that is anger. We live in a society whereby we still have a long way to go when it comes to addressing people's basic needs. There's an underlying silent anger that resonates within our society, and how hate speech in particular capitalizes on that anger because it knows that, for example, trust in institutions are at a low. How do I ignite this anger? By using certain terms and narratives, right? Then we've got polarization. And this further speaks to how society then ends up looking at divisions, right? And how do we deepen these divisions that we already know are there and have a potential to spark other online harms or offline harms? And these are the 3 key emotional appeals that are used when we're talking strategies in intersecting these 2. A bit of a case study. I'm using this in particular because it really took everyone by storm, but it also started with one term, and I think everyone would be familiar with it. So during COVID, the origination or how the virus or COVID originated, we ended up being, exposed to terms such as the Chinese virus, and how that term translated globally in different forms, because we've got a nationality that is present globally, right? But how hate speech and disinformation put together here, I think it was a clear case study of what it can do. Not only did we see how now globally they were treated differently, but how this narrative, no matter who they were, where they were from, even in the most powerful position they can be in, how their identity was stripped by these narratives, right? And I think we can see it in different forms, particularly when we're looking locally, how certain terms used can literally strip one's identity or one's humanity at the same time. And I think this highlights the real world consequences when we're talking about the intersectionality of mis and disinformation and hate speech. And once again, as disinformation, when a narrative is absorbed online and offline, and here I come as Nomshato in the middle of all of that, and I'm trying to combat it. I'm trying to come with the truth, right? I'm saying, guys, actually, here are the facts. It's very difficult because society has already set their mindset on the original narrative that they were exposed to. So after we started seeing that, we started seeing some movement that was being started globally, right? To say that we are not a virus, we're actually a nation. The same way Africa, in some instances, when we talk Ebola, when we talk HIV and AIDS, right? And even though these movements were really starting to gain pace, but because the narrative and the terms that have already been started, it was easily embedded in various societies. What are the consequences of the intersection? And I think I just want to run through these. So what we have here is an impact on society on two different folds. We've got social division. Hateful disinformation can really deepen polarization within communities. And what this does is it creates different groups in silos, right? That no matter if you can come into the space, it's almost like it's creating super glued echo chambers, right? That you can't really easily infiltrate because they've already been set. So the second to that is the loss of trust. And we shouldn't take weight away from trust, because that's the way you're able to communicate to society and to individuals, right? Then second to that is the impact on politics. What does this do? What is the end result? The end result is we're undermining our democracy, right? What we're doing is we're taking campaigns that are created in the essence of already stripping away our humanity, the human rights that we fight for every single day. And I'm told I've got 1 minute, so I'm going to wrap this up. I highlight this a lot and I take it back to the emotional appeal, the impact on individual well-being, meaning the psychological distress that individuals end up living in, right? Second to that is the stigmatization that happens within society and what it can lead to with certain groups. I'm almost done. The psychological effects, dehumanization, literally that's what it is, and that's what the aim of it is to do. The psychological trauma, coming back from that, triggers that happens for individuals when terms or certain narratives are being used. And in conclusion, in 2 seconds, hate speech relies on emotional appeal. And I think this is one of the essence and how it also thrives. As I said, it aims and looks at fear, anger, and polarization. And the consequences of this are profoundly dangerous. And I think the challenge here, as I said, it's looking at a multi-pronged approach. How are we coming into the space that we know can easily thrive on its own in the most dangerous means of ways? And I think I'll stop it there. And I tried my 1 minute. Thank you very much. Apologies, technology. I'm just trying to set Nzaka up with his presentation. There you go. All right. That's one.
Thank you, Nomshato. So my name is Nzako Manganye. I'm Program Manager for Community Building and Engagement. So mine is to take you through Real 411 and reporting on social media, reporting hate speech on social media. So I'm not going to take too much of your time. I'm just going to go through some of the steps that you need to follow when you are reporting at Real 411 and when you are reporting mis and disinformation, hate speech on social media platform. So first, I would like to speak about the Real 411. So Real 411 is a platform that that provides a way for people to combat digital offense by reporting them, safe from harassment and intimidation. So Real 411 is one of the initiatives that have that have been developed by MMA. So it was developed in 2019 in the lead up to the 2019 national and provincial election to give citizens an ability to report disinformation and misinformation to IEC, your electoral independent electoral commission. So that was done for that, and then we did that in collaboration with IEC in 2019. So what was happening then? One will report to Real 411, and IEC will be the one who adjudicate and take action and respond according to the offense that has been reported to the platform. So after the election, we realized that the platform was successful and there were lots of complaints which are related to disinformation around elections. And then we took it forward because we realized that disinformation, or our social media platforms were flooded with disinformation, harassment of journalists, hate speech, and all the things. And then we took it forward, and then we developed the system to, for the public, not to work for the election only. So we partnered with some other Chapter 9 institution, your Human Rights Commission, SANEF, Press Council, IABSA to make sure that there is something that can counter disinformation, and it also worked very well. I think in 2020 during the COVID-19, because the government came on board and then they requested that Real 411 be used as one of the platform where people can report mis and disinformation around COVID-19, because we didn't understand what was happening. COVID-19 just came out of the blue and everyone was shocked. So there was lots of disinformation as to what was going on. And then government come on board, and then they partnered with MMA, and then a Real 411 was one of the key components in fighting disinformation during that period. So coming into reporting at Real 411, so it's a very simple system. You just go to the Real 411 website, and then you will see on the website where you can submit a complaint. So when you submit a complaint, I think yesterday it was discussed a lot, but it was the relationship between Real 411 and IEC. So now I'm going to talk about Real 411 in general. So in Real 411, you can report disinformation, hate speech, incitement of violence, and journalist harassment. So these are 4 categories that can now be reported in Real 411. So when you go there, you will see all these 4 areas, and they are clearly defined. What is disinformation? As my colleague was talking about, what is disinformation, what is hate speech, what is incitement of violence, and journalist harassment. So you can see there, and then you report according to the disinformation that you are seeing on that social media platform. So these are the definition. I'm not going to go through them, as everyone can go to the site and see for themselves. And then number 2, so it will be asked to provide as many information as possible. But this information is not kept by us, it's kept by system. None of my colleagues will have your information as to who you are, and then what are you reporting them. And then number 3, and then it will ask you, where are you finding this information? You can report disinformation or misinformation or hate speech or harassment of journalists from WhatsApp, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, website, radio, and TV political ads. Number 4, so when you are reporting, you'll be asked also to provide the screenshot URL of that, of what we are reporting. If you are getting on Twitter, obviously, we have to copy the URLs there. And then what language? I think there was a question yesterday about language, whether we have all the languages, and Ralph One is one of our critical, components of our work, and it's have all South African official languages. So you can report in Xitsonga, you can report in Setswana, you can report in Xhosa at Ralph One. And then we just have to press submit button, and that will go to the reviewers. So what will happen when you submit? So these are 5 steps that your complaint will go through. You fill in the complaint form, you will receive an email. So immediately when you submit your complaint, you will receive an email with a reference number that your complaint is this reference number. And then the complaint will go through the digital complaint committee, of which is consists of the media, technology, and the legal people there. We will look at your complaint, and then we'll go back to the secretariat, and the secretariat will give a definition, and then when give it the definition, and then after, when they've made a decision whether it's disinformation or misinformation or hate speech or not hate speech, you will get a feedback, a personal feedback, and also the feedback will also be distributed at different channels, your social media platform, more especially the platform where you are reporting that some disinformation from. So there's a new development as well that I want to talk about. So we have a system which is called MAS. So MAS stands for Media Attack Reporting System. So over the years, some of us, our colleagues here, who understand very well and who have been in the media space, they probably have seen that there've been an increase in the attack on journalists or the media people or the media in general. The case in point, I can point the example of Karen Mon during the Jacob Zuma's case. So there was a lot of attack on her person as a personally, instead of looking at the issues that are involved. So we're developing a system called MAS. So MAS stands for Media Attack Reporting System. So journalists will be able to report attacks that are happening online, your Facebook, Twitter, of which we've seen lots of attacks for Karen Mon from. So journalists or media people should be able to report this system so that everyone can see for themselves. Government can go there, civil society can go there, members of the public can go there and see the amount of attacks that journalists are going through. So the system is not yet up and running, but it's already been developed. So what is going to happen, how to report, how the system is going to work is that journalists will have to create a profile in that particular system, MAS, and then MMA will verify if this person is a journalist or not. Obviously, if you're a journalist, you will know you have write something, we're working for this organization, of which is a news organization, a credible news organization, then we credit you and say that you are a journalist, and then you can complete your attack report, and then that will be there, and every time when members of the public goes and check the attack on journalists, will be able to see that information. Okay, so, and I also want to speak a little about how to report hate speech on social media platform. So on Facebook.
Is it okay if we don't give them this information? Why should we make it for them?
Okay, it's fine. So let me jump and summarize the social media platform. I understand many of us here, we know how to report this misinformation, hate speech on social media platform. And then I'll jump to so there was a talk about the Spotters Network, and I've seen some of the members of the Spotters Network. So the Spotters Network is a program that we have at MMA that we created, and it was firstly launched in 2020. So what the aim of the Spotters Network is to curb digital offenses and create an online space that is free from hate speech, harassment, excitement, while promoting truthful and accurate and credible news. So what the Spotters Network team does is what Nomshad was talking about, in counting the hate speech online. When you have a group of people who every now and then, when there's a hate speech, there's disinformation, they go and counter that. Or every now and then they assist MMA to, or general public to report, disinformation, hate speech or on Real for One. Say they are contributing immensely on reporting, on making many of these reports that we see online. So, and the programs now have over 133 members, if I'm not mistaken, beside the ones that we just recruited in the past 3 months, of which they make around over 50. So probably maybe around have over 280 something members of the Spotters Network. And these members of the Spotters Network, many of them, unfortunately, they coming from other African countries, because every time when we are out there, we make sure that we speak to people, and people subscribe to the Spotters Network, and then they report this and misinformation. So the Spotters Network is active, and I see some of them here, and I see some of the people that I spoke to about the Spotters Network in the last 2 days, and then they've expressed interest that they want to be part of the Spotters Network. So as a spotter, you assist with monitor and report the digital offenses at any time of your choosing. You don't have to be sitting on your phone or laptop, but every now and then when you come across mis or disinformation, you just report. So that's what basically says that you become one of those people who are, encountering disinformation online. So how to join the Spotters Network? You go to the MMA website, and then you type Spotters Network, and it will take you straight to the link of the Spotters Network, and then you join the Spotters Network, and then we will come back to you with the material, because there is material. I think Lisa mentioned that we have a toolkit. It's a new toolkit that we have been. There are more new toolkit that have been developed in the past. So this is the recent one that we are going to distribute. So people are going to join the Spotters Network are going to receive all the tools as to how to spot misinformation, hate speech, harassment of journalists, and incitement of violence online. So I don't have much to say. People who want to join the Spotters Network, who want to know something about Spotters Network, can talk to me, I can talk to Azola, can talk to Lisa, Nomshad, or everyone who's from MMA, and then we'll explain to you how does it work. Thank you.
Thanks, Sako, and apologies. We really did rush through this. I'm so sorry. We really did rush, and we didn't want to. So such a training needs maximum or minimum 3 days to deliver. And we just gave you a crash course into definitions of hate speech, the intersectionality of hate speech and mis and disinformation, a few different strategies that you can employ, and also how you can report on Real 411. If you need details on these, just speak to us as MMA. Like Sako says, if you need if you feel like you want to be a spotter, get in touch with us, and then you can access Real 411 very easily. There's this. Yep. There's a QR code there. I would take you through to the platform. So very easy. You can just we do need a lot of spotters. We cannot do this fight alone, as Media Monitoring Africa. We cannot, no one can do this fight alone. So we're always looking for people to join our networks, but we're also always looking for partners, in such programs. So if you feel like you and your organization or you as an individual would like to partner with us to deliver this training or to grow the Spotters Network, or just any of our efforts on combating hate speech and mis and disinformation, please feel free to get in touch with us. I will repeat, we're always looking for partners and we're always looking for supporters. Thank you so much for joining us this first part of the program. You are invited to some tea, coffee outside for just 5 to 10 minutes, and then you get back in the room for another exciting part of the program, which is Rate the Heads. Thank you so much. And the 5 minutes start now.
One announcement, just one. Hi everyone. Sorry, it's a very quick one. So we have an awesome booth exhibition there at the back for cool t-shirts. So if you are interested in buying one, this is me marketing it. Please have a look and visit our colleague in Tabise. Never.
Oh, helps if it's on. That's better. Those of you who've been with us for the last few days would have been exposed to a lot of things that would have been inspirational and exciting, sometimes a little bit worrying. And this morning and today, our last day, we are dealing with two series of issues that are particularly prickly and difficult to deal with, but also ones that are essential for us to deal with in South Africa. Hate speech this morning, whistleblowers later this evening. Now, hate speech is something that gets bandied around a lot by people on social media. People will say, oh, that's hate speech, this is hate speech. And sometimes hate speech is easy to define, right? Sometimes it is easy to see and to know and to identify it. But more often than not, hate speech sits in those shades of gray, where it may meet some of the criteria, but it doesn't meet others. And we thought rather than have a standard panel discussion on this, we wanted to do it as a game and as a set of scenarios. So we've set up a fantastic game. We've got teams of players who are going to be tasked with solving various scenarios. And instead of me, we've got someone who's actually a professional at these things, who you would have heard just this morning on 702, Bongani Bingwa, who I'll call up in just a moment. He's going to be the fabulous facilitator, certainly not me, because he's a lot more charming than I am. So outside of the dealing with the scenarios, what we're hoping for people to get out of this is to see just how difficult hate speech is to think through and to understand. So to help with that, we've got one of our country's best experts on hate speech, Advocate Ben Winks, who's going to help us understand where hate speech begins, where it ends, what the elements are, and what sort of things we can think about in relation to hate speech. So in a moment, once Bongani pulls up the teams, etc., they're going to follow Nomshado, who is there in pink. Teams, you know who you are. There's Nomshado. She's going to escort you away. So without any further thing, we want to just I have to thank our partners, SABC, MDDA, the German Embassy. Thank you very much. Without them, this wouldn't have been possible. So, and thank you to my lovely team this morning for accommodating my lateness. My humble apologies for that, everyone. So without ado, Bongani, please, up to you.
Coming, you say? Please spread the word. There are one or two ministers who don't believe that, who won't talk to me, but that's not the point. All right, most of what William has outlined, well, firstly, good morning, everyone. Hello. Most of what William has outlined is exactly how we're going to do this. My job is to facilitate, to keep all of this moving. You've already heard, of course, Ben Winks will be our judge. And so really the idea is that as the two teams deliberate on the various scenarios, we will have a discussion here in the room, and that will set us really nicely to be as well equipped as we can to judge the answers and the scenarios they will present to us. We've got two teams. Each team has two journalists and a legal eagle to obviously bolster the team's expertise, although I think the people that are said to be journalists on these teams are quite able to deal with this on their own. We've prepared 4 scenarios, and they're based on real examples, debates, and cases. And as I say, we'll have Ben Winks to guide us and to score points for either side as they make their presentations. So essentially what we'll have is we will have about 10 minutes given to the two teams to go and prepare how they will best deal with the scenarios. Whilst they do that, we will obviously have a discussion around how to set those up. They will come back into the room and they will have roughly 2 minutes to make the case around how they think this ought to be dealt with. And then at the end of that, they will be judged and scored, and then given the next scenario, and off they'll go, and we will discuss that in their absence. So that's pretty much how it works. The goal for the teams is to rate the hate where 10 is full on hatred and 0 is not hate at all, then they have to explain their decision in the 2 minutes they've been allocated, or less, of course, in a way, and this is some of the criteria, it's got to be easy for the audience to understand. If the team goes beyond 2 minutes, then I will step in and I will stop you and you may be penalized. So those are the rules, as it were. As you heard from William, it's tricky at times to define hate speech, but it's important, of course, that it be done, and it be done, I suppose, on a case-by-case basis and in a way that is accessible, and that's really what we aim to do. So let me introduce our teams, and on one side, team 1, shall we call them, is Reggie Mwalusi. Reggie, please come. Reggie is the executive director of SANEF. He's previously been editor-in-chief, both of the Daily Sun and the Sunday Sun. And that's exposed him, of course, to leading and training many young journalists. I'm not going to read everyone's CV because that's always so gauche, is it not? Joined by Nicole Fritz, who is the director of the Helen Suzman Foundation. And their legal eagle is Christy Chitengu, who's an activist, a researcher, and a writer with an interest in international human rights law. Please join. So that's team 1. Team 2 is Bongekile Maquphe. Please come also as well. Bongekile Maquphe is News 24's deputy politics editor, and Bongekile will be joined by Karen Morn, who is a legal journalist who writes for News 24. And their legal eagle is Claire De Hoos, who is, of course, a legal practitioner at Power and Associates. So those are the 2 teams. Without any further ado, let me give you your first scenario, and then you will leave the room and we will deliberate a little on that scenario and we will take it forward. So the first scenario, and I'm going to quote now, a South African singer, all right? A South African singer says, Disney's warned the world it's going to change its characters for children to every LGBTQ plus preference under the sun. Well, my generation learned to speak to mice, ducks, and dogs. Our children will be taught to have sex with ducks, mice, and dogs. You think it's weird, but let me tell you why I'm saying this. Those relationships with animals are part of that plus at the end of LGBTQ. And that includes those kinds of relationships with animals. Is it hate speech? Teams, off you go. You have 10 minutes. All right, I'm going to need some guidance when they're out of earshot, because they will obviously need to be out of earshot for us to be able to talk about this. Are we good to go? So Ben, I suppose if I'm going to ask you to come forward, and I don't know if you need a mic, or if you'll just, well, you've got a mic there. I suppose just as a broad definition, both William and I have said, hate speech is at times hard to define. Would you agree with that?
Thank you. I'd say probably all the time, it's tricky to define. It is obviously fact specific. It is a question of context, like every legal question or ethical question. It's a question of historical context, social context, interpersonal context. And all of these factors are very difficult to apply to words. which in isolation could be innocuous or could be egregious.
One of the ongoing debates, I imagine, is going to be that delicate balance between defining hate speech and somebody's right to freedom of expression. That's always an argument that's brought up.
Yes, so there's a boundary between, I'm speaking loosely, between free speech and hate speech. So what our constitution does, which is modeled in this respect on the post-World War II international conventions, is it says that everyone has a right to freedom of speech, which includes press freedom, the freedom to receive and impart information and ideas. But that right does not extend to three things: propaganda for war, incitement of imminent violence, and advocacy of hatred that constitutes incitement to cause harm. And they list 4 grounds of hatred, which is race, ethnicity, gender, and religion. For historical reasons, those were the only ones included. But hate speech, as it's commonly understood, applies to any protected group identity. So the Constitution says that that kind of speech can never be free speech. It can never be protected speech. But even if it's not that kind of extreme hate speech, you can still get more, what's the word? Or less egregious hate speech or less extreme hate speech, which the state still has the power to limit, still has the power to regulate. Like the law regulates insulting people, defaming people. You can say, oh, it's my free speech, but even though the Constitution doesn't exclude defamation, the law, the common law and various statutes say that you can't publish things that hurt people's reputations or publicize their personal information, violate privacy.
Why are those insufficient, as it were, to deal with hate speech? Why do we need, in South Africa, for example, a bill or legislation that is specific to this issue?
Yes, that's a good question. So that's been a lot of the debate, is whether we ever needed a hate speech prohibition at all. Now, there's 2 kinds of hate speech prohibitions we need to look at. One is criminal. Should people go to jail for hate speech? And the other is civil, whether a person who's aggrieved by hate speech can actually get an apology or damages or community service or an interdict to stop their neighbor or their co-worker from harassing or expressing hatred on the basis of some kind of prohibited grounds. And the existing law wasn't sufficient, because what the Constitution did was it introduced a right that never existed in South Africa before, which is the right to equality. So you had a right to reputation, you had a right to dignity, but there was no such thing as a right to equality for historical reasons. And there was no common law wrong, such as infringing a person's equality. And that's why we needed to fashion a new right and a new remedy against violating a person's dignity as a woman, as a queer person, as a foreign national.
Well, I mean, I promised the audience that you're going to guide us in a way so that we're, in a sense, prepared for the answers we may get from the 2 teams. One might look at the scenario as we've outlined it that they're dealing with now and say, oh, come on, thought police much? It is what I think. How does that harm somebody else? It may well be that this is what Disney will end up doing, whether intended or not.
The line, in my view, is, and Nomshado alluded to this earlier, is where you dehumanize people, where you reach into somebody's human dignity, you reach into their equal worth and you rip it out. That's where the line is crossed. In my view, this particular comment, we'll hear the arguments from the teams, but this is where you debase people on the basis of a protected group identity. So we as a society have decided, constitutionally entrenched, the equality of people based on sexual orientation and gender identity. It's not up for debate. Whether people on any gender, any place on the gender spectrum or any sexual orientation are entitled to equal human worth That's not up for debate in South Africa. So legally speaking, and I mean, I'm not going to engage in religious debates. It's not my job. It's not my expertise. But legally speaking, that is settled. If you undermine people's equal worth on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, you are committing a constitutional wrong.
Right, I think that gives us more or less enough time for the teams to come back, or do we still have a little bit more? We've got another 4 minutes. All right, maybe let's continue then some of this conversation as we go. So how might, because what's interesting for me is that all these scenarios are actual examples that, you know, have been out there. How does our law deal with this?
So this case, I mean, there are no points for guessing who said it, who the famous singer was. It was Steve Hofmeyr, of course, a proponent of
All
various
sorts of things.
flavors of hate speech against almost everybody except his own group. He made these comments in a video on Facebook, and a complaint was lodged against him in the Equality Court. I'll say perhaps a little while we have a couple of minutes, I'll say something in a moment about what the Equality Court is and does.
They're back.
They're back. Okay. Perhaps I'll tell you the result of that case in our next
Okay.
breakaway.
And link it to the Kwalana matter. All right, teams. May I invite team 1 to come up? So just a reminder to everyone, we are rating the hate. 10, full on hatred, 0, no hate at all. And do we have a timekeeper? Nomshata, are you ready? Team 1, your approximately 2 minutes begins now. They need mics. Have a seat. I mean, unless you want to stand. But be comfortable, have a seat. There's mics in every chair. All right, Nomshado, your time, she says, begins now.
Good afternoon, everyone. So we've rated the hate an 8 out of 10. We have done so because we believe that the comment is harmful. It does not incite harm, so the comment is not soliciting other people to act in a harmful way towards the group that is being targeted, but the comment itself targets the LGBTQI community, and one of the prohibited grounds of discrimination is gender. And so the LGBTQI plus community is it is based off of gender orientation. And so we think that this is hateful, and based on a reasonable and objective test, it is clear that the comment targets a specific group, and that anyone from this group can feel that this is targeting them, and that this just actively attacks that community. I don't know if my other team members would like to add.
Only to say that that in its kind of promotion and propagation of hatred and incitement to harm, we believe that the statement clearly calls for a kind of dehumanization of and degradation of the LGBTQI plus group. And we also take account of the context. This is a group which in context is one which has experienced subordination and does not have access to the power dynamics of more privileged groups.
Reggie, time is up. You done? All right, team 1, thank you very much. You guys can have a seat. Team 2, please.
Do you guys all have mics?
Okay, so we rated this 10 out of 10, and as the previous team said, it was, mic working? Okay. Now? Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so we rated this a 10 out of 10 because we said that it is particularly hateful and discriminatory towards the gay community in South Africa, which is already the target of extreme levels of violence. There's well-documented numerous cases where people have been raped and murdered solely based on their gay identity, which is one of the prohibited grounds that is identified by PAPUDA. There is an equation, essentially a suggestion or an underlying trope about gay people that they will have sex, for example, with non-consenting creatures like children. And the bestiality example is another example of a completely ill-conceived trope that gay people are just going to indiscriminately have sex with whether consent is provided or not, and that's particularly heinous. It's dehumanizing. We suspect it was uttered by one Steve Hofmeyr, and we think that essentially in the South African context, it is particularly incendiary. The Constitutional Court in Kwalane was at pains to say that while for a long time hate speech was considered the incitement of imminent harm to a particular group based on an identity, Kwalane has made it very clear that harm includes psychological trauma and distress. And when you're talking about a group that is particularly vulnerable to victimization, abuse, and higher levels of suicide, this kind of comment will only further perpetuate alienation and that kind of self-harm.
And we rated it 10 out of 10.
10 out of 10. All right, you guys are fine. Thank you, team 2.
Don't twist. They're going to have to answer the other 3 in 10 minutes. And then we'll
The
take
other
all
3. Okay. There's a game twist. I was meant to now give you scenario 2, but in fact, what I'm told I must do is give you scenario 2, 3, and 4. You will have 10 minutes and then come back and give us feedback on all 3. So scenario 2, at a political rally, a political leader says, and I quote, "Any white racist that threatens and confronts our members and leaders, that is an application to meet his maker with immediate effect." Rate the hate. Scenario 3, an Operation Dudula tweet. I quote, "This hashtag National Shambox Day. Let's get rid of these foreigners, the rapist from Zim, the drug dealer from Nigeria. I can't say that word. Those selling us poison. We will beat them out of our communities." Scenario 4, a woman journalist. "You are nothing," this is directed towards a woman journalist, "you are nothing but a Stratcom whore, you stupid bitch. Stop these lies. We are coming for you. We know where you live." And I'm pleased to tell you these have been printed for you, so you've got them. But for the benefit of the room, those are our scenarios. All right, teams, you've got 10 minutes. Whew. Thank you. All right. Not just advocate, but now Judge Ben Wings in this scenario. We good? I mean, some of them they're even hard to read aloud in front of a room of people. Oh,
No, these cases are extremely difficult to deal with in practice. So I acted for the South African Chinese community in a 5-year hate speech trial against Facebook users. There had been thousands, literally thousands of comments. In fact, I think you may know about this. I think you might have been anchoring at the time on Carte Blanche. There was an episode about the illicit trade in donkey hides to Asian market for use in traditional Asian medicine. And there was an avalanche of comments on social media, directed not simply at people involved in the trade who come from all races and backgrounds and nationalities, but against Chinese people as a race. Comments like, we need to get Chinese out of South Africa. They steal our jobs, they eat our dogs, they're not welcome. We need to get rid of these slant-eyed freaks. And my client, the chairman of the Chinese Association, had to read these out in court. It was in front of a courtroom of 150 Chinese people. And, you have to relive that trauma in these kinds of cases. There's the secondary victimization, and then a tertiary victimization when the other side has their chance to put their defense. And in that case, one of the opponent's counsel said to the deponent, who they kept in the witness box for 8 days, isn't this a little thing? Aren't there bigger problems in the world? Isn't this one of the tweets, we should kill their children as a cure for the common babbalans? And it was an extremely emotionally trying experience for the community. But at the end, they got a judgment vindicating their human dignity and their sense of national belonging as South Africans. I mean, Chinese people have been here for 5 generations, longer than my family. And yet nobody questions my South Africanness because of the way I look. Yeah, these cases are very difficult to relive. The same goes for the Kwelane case that was mentioned. Extremely difficult process of giving testimony and listening to the arguments of the other side, which minimize the dehumanization. Perhaps just to help the audience with a couple of concepts that heard in the last in the feedback session from the teams. So you heard mention of something called PEPUDA. Now, I said that there's a type of civil liability for hate speech, and that's this Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, which deals with unfair discrimination on various grounds, harassment, and hate speech. And that defines it, and the definition was refined by the court in the Kwelane case, which was also mentioned, as any words or any expression that is based on prohibited grounds, and a panoply of prohibited grounds, any group identity essentially, which may reasonably be construed to demonstrate an intention to either, well, to A, be harmful or to incite harm, and B, to promote or propagate hatred. That then is hate speech. And you can get civil liability for that. Special courts were created called the equality courts, where the judges and magistrates have special training in social context, where you can get special remedies like an apology, an interdict, damages, and even racial sensitization training for the offenders and that sort of thing. So that will hopefully clarify some of the concepts that were mentioned in the last session.
We will all remember, of course, how what until then may have seemed an innocuous word, cockroach, used in Rwanda, and what unfolded there. Are there any remedies? Because if I'm thinking of the last scenario, and I remember the person to whom it was directed, and that we know where you live, beyond just the dehumanization of the individual, but the idea that one could easily say it was just a tweet, or I spoke out in anger, I didn't direct anyone, but someone else may then act upon what was said.
Yeah. There's a sliding scale in a way of threats or incitement. So incitement is a very elusive and elastic concept. A lot of people take the view that you need to be expressly calling for some kind of action. And we know Where You Live comes pretty close to that, is an invitation to people to find this person. I think it's because I'm standing too close to the speaker. This microphone's going a bit haywire. Then even taking the first example that the plus in LGBTQ plus includes bestiality. That, in my view, is a form of incitement. You're inciting people to shun, to alienate, to degrade.
Because if I don't see you as human, then I shouldn't feel too bad in acting out.
Exactly.
In whatever way.
People who agree with you. So your audience or the in-group is meant to be, your purpose is to inspire them to alienate and degrade and shun, to mistreat the out-group that's being targeted. All hate speech has some kind of intent or effect of influencing the mind of the in-group. I say all hate speech, but there's also interpersonal hate speech where one person confronts another person with a racial slur, for example, and there's no one else to hear it. There's a case where obviously there's no incitement, but incitement is not a requirement. Are they back?
No, they're not.
Okay.
They've got 4 more minutes.
So that's a gray area that's been left by Kwelane, and some academics say that calling somebody the K word or the C word is not hate speech on its own, that there needs to be some kind of wider dissemination. I disagree. I think it is hate speech. I don't think it is covered by the common law insult action or the crime of crimen injuria. Yes, a person will be guilty of those, but you lock the doors of the Equality Court, which are informal, inexpensive, expeditious, for people affected by that kind of treatment. And there were many cases before Kwelane of, in fact, the majority of hate speech cases concerned this kind of interpersonal hate speech.
Are instruments a sufficient deterrent?
They're not sufficient, but they are essential. So obviously there's a lot of work to be done socially, educationally, but the law has to provide a remedy. So there's no right without a remedy, is a common saying, in legal circles at least. If somebody gets injured, there has to be a remedy. So the law must at least provide that. And also the law and the courts set boundaries for what is appropriate behavior. So having a legal prohibition on sexual offenses doesn't cure the country of sexual offenses, but it is a minimum. At the very least, you must have the law telling people how they should and shouldn't behave and vindicating their rights when those rights are violated.
This being a media conference, what lessons do you think we as media practitioners in this room ought to be aware of in our reportage around these issues?
One thing is to be a bit more, I'll use a recent example. There was a very popular newspaper that had a headline saying it was about how to spot counterfeit goods. And the headline was 10 ways to spot Hong Kong merchandise. Now, having acted for the Chinese community over 5 years, I was approached, and there is a deep hurt experienced by the use of this phrase that the in-group, the majority of South Africans feel is innocuous. It's just something that's acquired this colloquial meaning, and no harm is meant. But it's not about what is meant, it's about what is felt on the other side. I think we can be a bit more compassionate, and there was a press complaint lodged, the newspaper defended it, the newspaper won. The Chinese community remains deeply hurt by it. And in their complaint, they had reached out and said, maybe you might even reconsider. We're not trying to vilify you. We understand that you didn't know that this was wrong, but maybe you should reconsider, which they didn't. I think to be very careful about, and a lot of the messaging around COVID-19, I think provided a very important lesson for the media in how to report language that can alienate, language that can marginalize.
Oh, okay. I don't want to start another thing and then they arrive. I mean, I think we've got a responsibility, particularly in the digital age, where we so often fall into the trap of merely echoing what's already out there without the filters that we need to have in these conversations.
Yes, I think there's a duty to, I think another thing there was a lot of debate about this. I think everyone in the media space is aware of it, that in response to the Marshalltown fire, that politicians were then allowed to have free rein to blame migrants for occupying buildings illegally and, disseminating this kind of disinformation, which feeds into hateful narratives. And there's on the media to challenge those narratives when they're being propagated.
Thank you very much. This time we'll start with team 2. Surely not. 2 minutes for all of them? 2 minutes each, but as one report back. Yes, for each scenario. So perhaps, and maybe we can split it so that you don't give all your answers.
Oh, yeah.
I think that might be more fair. Eh? Correct. All right, so shall we start with scenario 2, please?
Okay, so in that scenario, we suspect it was Julius Malema because it's the kind of thing you would say, but we said that it wasn't strictly defined as hate speech. We would give it about a 3 out of 10, because he doesn't identify white people in their entirety. He says white racists, and he identifies a whole lot of scenarios which could result in someone, quote unquote, booking an appointment with their maker, which is not a direct incitement to violence. It's heavily nuanced. There's a strong suggestion there, but I'm not sure that it would amount to an immediate incitement to violence. Is it offensive? Is it going to hurt people's feelings? Yes. Does it constitute immediate harm? No. So we have said we've rated that quite low. On the Dudula thing, we've said that is a 10 out of 10 because a direct incitement of violence against people who are criminalized basically as a result of their nationality. There's openly violent language there. There's a suggestion that, you're a Zimbabwean rapist. It's fundamentally dehumanizing, and it's legitimizing what is in fact a criminal act. To beat or to harm or to murder someone based on their nationality is not acceptable in any way, shape, or form. And then with the woman journalist, it wasn't me. I think it was Karima Brown. That was a scenario in which, she was openly doxxed by the EFF, but it's not, we gave that a 3 out of 10 because strictly speaking, it's not hate speech. The courts have said that identifying occupations as a group of people, they didn't accept that. They didn't say that journalists as a group should be protected. And they have been reluctant to say that careers or whatever should be protected under PAPUDA. It is harassment, it is intimidation, it is harmful, but there are other mechanisms within the law that are available to her. And so hate speech can't be the first and last resort. In this scenario, if I remember correctly, I think Karima went and got a protection order because what she was being subjected to was harassment and intimidation. And again, the language is very gendered. It's typical of what a lot of female journalists will face. But we don't, typically when we are confronted with this, we don't pursue hate speech complaints. We'll potentially look at a protection order or some kind of application with regards to harassment.
Just to add one thing, I think it's important for all the scenarios to remember that the test for hate speech is an objective one. So whereas the Dudula, it's quite clear that it falls under the parameters of hate speech objectively, the other two, how they're interpreted is more subjective, and that also adds to what we've said about how we rate them.
Okay. All right. Okay, thank you very much. Team 1.
Let's go.
Thanks, Bongana. No, look, scenario 2, the politician whom we assume that we all know who he is, I think our debate was really around white racists and the generalization of whites. And to say, I mean, if you are going to make a determination when it comes to hate speech, it has to be proven. There has to be a legal discourse to prove that. But South Africa being South African political supporters, being those, our debate was, there's a white person, there's a white racist. If I'm going to go out after such a speech, how do I differentiate between this white person and this white racist? But anyhow, because we're talking hate speech here, we said our rating will be 2 out of 10. Nicole?
Say, to emphasize that it is important that these instances be viewed contextually and right. It's plausible to understand that these views might be uttered in an inflammatory way, but for instance, if the speaker is the leader of the Abahlali who have been targeted by white racists, it's easy to see that this particular statement would not be one which it doesn't rise to the level of hate speech. There are no prohibited grounds. The other thing that we would say is that we suspect it wasn't uttered by Abahlali, but rather by an EFF leader. And again, I mean, hate speech is obviously a very clear prohibition of speech, but political leaders need to speak responsibly, even if that speech isn't one which rises to the level of hate speech.
Scenario 3, Operation Dudula. We rated this a 10 out of 10. It was clear that this was discrimination based off of origin and nationality, and it incites immediate harm by the hashtag National Shambok Day, and also it spreads propaganda of hatred through the various stereotypes that are in this statement, and that's why we rated it a 10 out of 10.
And can I just say, it's not only that it suggests that foreign nationals are criminal, right? It also plays to these alarmist fears, suggesting that South Africans are in imminent danger themselves. So if they don't take measures, they will be the targets of activity, which is not just criminal, but actively puts them in danger. So it's hard to imagine a statement which is less clearly hate speech, which is why we rated it 10 out of 10.
Good. Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, just to add to that, we are not being helped by some politicians who come in. We all know who they are, and then they support statements like Operation Dudulas. But we are quite happy that it has come down, particularly since the leader there, his house was bombed and he lost his family. So I'm quite happy. The last scenario, as Karen was saying, I mean, it's a word that came, if you remember well, with Anton Hawa and Thandeka Gubulembergi, and we're quite happy that it has come down. But also on that, I mean, that's a straight 10 out of 10. Because here we're talking about, I mean, causing harm. We're talking about knowing someone's address and coming for her, and using words like beach, like war, and all of that. War, and I think Karima did well. Anton and them and all the journalists involved here did well by standing up and then taking the legal course and make Karima's soul rest in peace. But this was a straight 10 out of 10. And we further said what makes it also 10 out of 10 is the continuation, what we continue to see today in South Africa with the online harassment, bullying, intimidation, and threats, like particularly against women journalists in this country. So there's no brainer here. It was a 10 out of 10.
And can I just add there? I mean, those terms whore and bitch are so stereotypically pejorative of women, right? And lower estimation of women, this idea that they're sexual objects, that they're there to be bought. But I suppose given their prevalent currency in our society, that sometimes we don't appreciate fully the extent to which they further dehumanize an entire gender. So unlike Team One, we actually were of the view that this constitutes hate speech, and really pretty horrific hate speech.
Okay, you fine? Thank you. Going to hand over to our esteemed judge. What did you make of all of that? In fact, you can come and stand here also.
Thank you very much to the teams for very insightful and thought-provoking assessments of the different scenarios. It's instructive of the complexity of these kinds of cases, that you can have such divergent views between two groups of people who in many ways would be of similar mind about human rights orientation and that sort of thing, and free speech. Let me go through each one, and I think I have to pick a winner or declare a draw on each scenario. So on Disney's LGBTQ plus agenda, Steve Hofmeyr. So I promised earlier I'd tell you about the outcome of that case. So a complaint was lodged against Steve Hofmeyr. He opposed it initially, and then he basically pled guilty, came to an agreement with the Human Rights Commission and paid a fine and issued an apology. A fine, or rather a donation of damages to a queer rights organization, which obviously was the right approach from his perspective. He had a hopeless case, in my view. I agree with the teams that it was very clear hate speech. It's propagating a very common trope, and this is an important element in assessing hate speech, is the extent to which the speech ties in with historical dehumanizing tropes about people. So you find in a lot of anti-Semitic speech that there are, common tropes. In anti-Nigerian speech, the drug dealer trope. We'll come back to that one later. But how it ties into historical patterns of marginalization and dehumanization is important. And this bestiality trope, it's the same one that was used by John Goelane, may his soul not rest in peace. Sorry, I know that's a divisive comment. Now, the 8 out of 10 versus 10 out of 10. I think that the explanation given by Team One was, to me, a bit more persuasive, because even though they gave, I would probably pitch it about an 8 out of 10 myself, because although there is a degree of incitement, there isn't a very specific call to violence of any sort, which would typically push it to the 10 out of 10 side of the scale. But it is clearly hate speech. And I liked the reference to the context of subordination. We're talking about a particularly marginalized and brutalized set of communities. There's often people say community, but obviously it's a wide variety of communities that fall under an umbrella. And for that reason, I would go with Team One for the first scenario. So we can give them now, number 2, the application to meet your maker. This is a very tricky one. So there has been a complaint lodged against Julius Malema for this comment, which was directed at white racists, white supremacists. And I found particularly insightful the comment from Team One that, so I incline to the view given by Team Two, that when you're directing a comment at white racists, that's not a protected group. Being a white supremacist is not a protected identity. And there's also the idea, when you're looking at historical and social context, there's a punching up and punching down. So often when we discuss whether comedians are committing hate speech, are they punching up or are they punching down? It's an important question, because sometimes you can be challenging power, you can be challenging patriarchy, you can be challenging bigotry, challenging white supremacy. And you might then be accused of being anti-men, anti-Christian, whatever the case may be, because you're challenging what you regard as sources of oppression. So here you would say that there is a context of when you're challenging white racists as such, that would be not a hateful thing to do. But the more nuanced question is whether in making that comment, you are making a generalization that white people generally are racist, as Reggie alluded to. Now, that's a very tricky question. And this is a question that came up in the Masuku case in the Constitutional Court, where Kasatu leader Bongani Masuku had been taken to task over comments he made about Zionists. And the debate in the Constitutional Court was whether the word Zionist is coded language for Jewish person. It was a very complicated, very difficult, very nuanced debate. And ultimately, the Constitutional Court found that in 3 out of the 4 utterances, it was not coded language for Jewish person. And in one of the utterances, he had spoken in such a way that it would be offensive to Jewish people more generally. The judgment's been criticized, but I think it certainly illustrates the complexity of coded language. And I actually don't know where I stand on this question of whether it's whether it would be coded language or not, but I'm glad it was raised. But I think I would probably incline to the view given by, again, team 1, that it would be more of a 2 out of 10 rather than a 3 out of 10. And again, I like the highlighting of the coded language aspect. So again, it's a team 1 for scenario 2. Then Operation Dudula, both gave 10 out of 10. So I have to decide.
general and the society. That's why she doesn't have another remedy beyond harassment.
Yeah, the problem that we have is that judges are humans, and many of them are men, most of them are men. They have sexist biases, many of them have racist biases. There was a very interesting analysis done of Colin Lamont's original Dubuli Bunu judgment, where he found that Dubuli Bunu was hate speech in 2011. And a critical race theory lens was applied by Prof. Joel Modiri to that judgment, exposing the judge's racial biases in the way he'd written the judgment. And then you find a black judge saying that, well, it's not hate speech. And I think that judgment on its terms was much more persuasive on the evidence. But there's a need for equality court judges. This is an argument I've made elsewhere, to undergo critical race theory training in feminist theory, queer theory. But for me personally, I mean, one of the reasons why I like practicing in hate speech law is because it's a developing area and we get to keep making law as we go. So we brought the apartheid flag case because apartheid denialism is a problem. We already had many precedents about overt racism, like the K word. But then apartheid denialism and colonial denialism, those are problems that political leaders and former presidents were propagating that needed to be addressed. And for me personally, we have good precedents on queer rights. What we don't have is precedent on patriarchy. And patriarchy is the next frontier for hate speech for me. It needs to be, even with losing cases, we need to keep asserting constitutional conscience against the human condition. And that human condition includes patriarchal judges, patriarchal mindsets on the bench. We had the interview of now Deputy Chief Justice Maya, who was vying for the position of Chief Justice.
Yeah.
And she was demeaned based on her sex by Dali Mpofu. And the chair did nothing about it.
Yeah.
None of the men said anything about it. There's patriarchies, the cradle of patriarchy these days is cowardice. And that's something that needs to be exposed and eradicated.
I mean, as far as I know also, and I'm just double checking this, Karima didn't succeed in a hate speech campaign. She succeeded in accusing them of infringing the Electoral Act with the death threats and the rape threats. So it was never, and I know because I spoke to her. She used to phone me and sort of speak about, you know, the stuff that we were going through, and she would support a lot of the younger journalists. And then I went to a funeral when she passed away of COVID, and people were openly celebrating her death and hoping that I died too. And when I was in hospital with COVID, I had people saying, you must die like that bitch Karima. So, you know, this isn't, it's just, and you know, Nicole probably get frustrated with me for mentioning this, but Nicole's been subjected to this because of the ZEP case, open threats on her and her children. And, you know, it's the most horrendous fact of life for us. And my biggest fear is that, you know, one of the events that I went to yesterday, it came out that so few people are studying journalism because this kind of overt shaming, this will happen to you, don't ask questions. And I must say that, you know, as a white woman, I have a lot of privilege and protection. It is far worse for Black women, Black female journalists. The kind of thing that they are subjected to behind the scenes is a lot worse than what I am facing publicly as someone who is well known and has my veneer of privilege around me. It's horrible, but I shudder to think what is happening in newsrooms with junior reporters who are being disgraced. I've had queer colleagues openly indicted over their sexuality. It is just a fact of life. And I think also, and I'll wrap up, I know I'm talking too much, but one of the things is that we are so socially tolerant of this. Like people will just be like, oh shit. And it's always like people will send you messages like, oh my God, what did you do? And I'm like, I did my fucking job, for God's sake. You know what I'm saying? I did my job, guys.
Do we have any questions broadly in the room? There's a hand at the back.
It's not more of a question, but just it's a little bit of a question, but also statements as well. I'd like to know if Karen Moon, Matsitiso Madia, and all the other women journalists and the leading people in our industry, if they are attacked at this level, what does it mean then for junior journalists like us? Like, what kind of protection do we get? Because honestly speaking, on social media these days, the way that misinformation and disinformation works, it's coming from really powerful nations and really powerful places. And it's hard to discredit these people if you don't have enough social capital on your side. And also as a journalist, when you have to leverage your credibility against these really incredible, powerful nations, if Karen Moore is failing at that and she is Karen Moore, who am I? You know, and this week has really been trying in terms of misinformation and disinformation, especially in the field of the news, with what's happening in the conflict in Israel and between Israel and Palestine. It's really difficult to moderate information, especially because the media spaces that we are meant to actually trust, we can now see that there's an agenda behind those spaces. And also we're starting to see that those same media houses, I'm also going to call them out, they're not protecting their journalists as much as they should. So then where do we go if these media houses that exist are not protecting journalists as much as they should? And also as a journalist, I can't afford to go to therapy. I don't have medical aid, you know, so then how is it that we protect our mental health? And then we are junior journalists as well. If Karen Moore is being attacked at the level that she's attacked at, you don't even want to see my DMs right now coming from this week from people overseas. It's harrowing. It's shocking. And I had to fight a nation this week, an entire nation, against misinformation and disinformation. This nation is powerful. I'm not going to say anything because, but the point that I'm trying to make is that where are we protected if Karen Moore is not protected? Who are we?
Or indeed at an institutional level where media owners are worried about their bottom line and the commercial imperative. And, you know, you must toe a particular line or else. These are all considerations that are before us. And I think perhaps a discussion like this, William and Media Monitoring Africa, is so necessary because if nothing else, hopefully what we take from a discussion such as we've had this morning is that when these conversations occur, those of us who can speak do so. Those of us who may not be directly affected or implicated, who may use our voices to be heard and say, not in my name. Thank you, everyone.
Wow, that was really cool, beyond our hopes at least. Thank you so much, everyone. We are going to give our token prizes to our contestants because it's a token game, but with very real consequences. And I mean, that certainly came across in the discussion, right? It was just how real these things are and how brave the people are who bring us the news, how brave they are and continue. And in fact, not just the news though, right? Because it's people that are doing their jobs to try and make South Africa a better place. Like Nicole in the room, like our other young journalists in the room, those of us that are fighting for social justice, we have to keep fighting, and it's probably going to get a lot worse before it gets better. But luckily, there are a lot of good people that will stand with you. Ben, thank you very much for your excellent, insightful positions. There were so many one-liners I wanted to, I can't type fast enough to get them down, but you know, it was so lovely about just thinking about, just because the language is common, it doesn't mean it should be devoid of its hate value, which is a lovely thing to think about, right? Especially in the context of the discussion we had at the end of wrapping that up. Bongani, thank you so much for doing such a splendid job, indulging the game twist, keeping us moving along on time. So let's hand out our token prizes and then I'll do another vote of thanks. Thank you to our participants, our team members. You were excellent. Thank you again to our legal eagles. We work with our lovely friends at Alt Advisory and Power Law. They have a team of young people. These are just two of them. There's heaps of them over at the office. They're all working on an urgent at the moment. So we have managed to steal these two. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant young people. And thank you so much for your time. We love you. So we've got some lunch now outside. I'm not sure if are we down there or are we up here? Down there. So it means you walk down the hill. It's a lovely rose garden. It's lovely and shady and cool, and you can decompress from this. My apologies. I did want to issue a trigger warning at the start of this. You'll go, well, that's a bit late now, William, you chopstick. So I'm very sorry about that. I did mean to issue it just before we started, but I was a little bit harried. So thank you very much, everyone, for being with us this morning. I understand that our first part was really super cool as well. We've got our last event for our Media Freedom Festival, followed by a fabulous cocktail party this evening. So that's join us at 6, is it? Yeah. Join us at 6. Reggie won't be with us, I know, but they've got another dinner this evening. But thank you so much, everyone, for being with us. And I think if we leave, to remember that we need to stand with those when they need it most and when they're being attacked. And hopefully we've got some things coming that'll help make some